culture humility is this posture that allows leaders to navigate the complexity that comes with creating a sense of belonging in their organizations and the psychological safety.
Hello, you're listening to Relationships at Work, a leadership podcast helping you build workplace connection, improve culture, and avoid blind spots. I am ever your host, Russell Lulker, a communications and leadership expert, couple of successful decades in both those areas, whole heap of curiosity too, just like you, on how we can make the workplace a better place. Today, we're getting into the culture of it all. It is always an underlying theme to every episode we talk with guests or my solo episodes, but this one, it's about getting humble. My guest today has written a book about cultural humility. I like that. I like that a lot because I don't know if we respect culture enough. A lot of organizations just look at culture as a one umbrella word, like the entire organization is one culture, when there's so many different subcultures with so much nuance that come from geography, that come from age, that come from gender, all over the map. And I think we need to get really intentional when it comes to culture, really humble when it comes to culture. And I think my guest today really hammers it home and really gives us something to chew on and think about when it comes to us as leaders and our cultural humility. So let's get started. On the show today, we have Dr. Joel Pérez, and here is why he is awesome. He's an executive and leadership coach, speaker, and consultant. He is owner of Apoyo Coaching and Consulting, LLC, and a professional certified coach with the International Coach Federation, ICF, for those like their acronyms. He's as well as other coach certifications with the Academy of Creative Coaching and in Gallup Strengths. His books, Dear White Leader, How to Achieve Organizational Excellence Through Cultural Humility, yeah, I'm working on the words, helps leaders develop their cultural humility for individual, organizational, and community change. I have a feeling that's going to be a big part of our topic today. And he's here. Hello, Doctor.
Hey, and thank you for having me, Russell. It is so good to be here. And just to clarify, as we were talking about earlier, apoyo means support for in Spanish. And so I'm here to support people, and I do that by listening and providing clarity, providing support that a lot of our leaders need in the work that they do.
I appreciate the clarity. As we also mentioned, as a Canadian, there's not as much of a Spanish push for us to understand Spanish as much as other nationalities and backgrounds. So appreciate the clarity. So even though most of my listeners are American, to be blunt.
Right.
So appreciate that immensely. But before we get anywhere, sir, we have a question I have to ask all my guests, which is, what is your best or worst employee experience?
Oh, yeah, I've done some reflection on this because I have a bit of both, right? And so for me, I would say, and I talk about this when I do workshops and present with different organizations, is because one of the things I talk about is letting go of our assumptions, biases, and certainty in doing this work of developing cultural humility. And one of the certainty pieces that I had was I would never lose my job. In any of the work that I did, I just was certain that I was always going to be employed. Well, lo and behold, my first job out of graduate school, I made a mistake that I own, but the organization decided to let me go. And it was I think they could have handled it better in the way it was communicated. And it was a live-in position. So my wife and I were living in our residence, and we had to vacate our residence and move in with some friends who took us in. But that was the worst for me experience, but also taught me a lot. And really learned early on about integrating a growth mindset, even when we make mistakes. And so that's my worst experience, was losing my job, my first job out of graduate school.
And you said to make mistakes, but it sounds like something that just happened to happen. So
yes.
It's not so much a mistake as circumstances, if I'm, again,
yes,
to be clear.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what did you take with you? Was it a matter of resilience to the next place? Is it a matter of trust within the organization that they have your best interests? Like, what was it that you took with you?
Yeah, well, one, I realized that I'm replaceable, that no matter how much I love an organization, how much I'm loyal to an organization, the organization doesn't owe me anything, even though I would like to think that they do. And it was early in my career, so I thought I was invincible, right? Like, how can you replace me? Like, I do this awesome work. While the reality is, no, I'm replaceable. And that was a life lesson for me. In that, I realized that I needed to have what you said, resilience. I chose to be resilient. It also created space for reflection. In one, career wise, was this the right vocation for me, given what had happened? Or did I want to continue on this path of being in organizations like this one, in where I'm serving students and keys in? I was working at a college and university at the time, and wanted to mirror, particularly those students who shared, whose identities I shared. Right, I identify as Mexican American, Chicano, Latino. Spanish was my first language. At that time, there weren't a lot of us in the academy. And I chose this vocation because I wanted to mirror for students who look like me and had very similar experiences, so they can see themselves being successful. But that particular moment, I started questioning: is this right for me? And so resilience, reflection, discernment, also a lot of good mentoring that I sought out. But I was really wanting to, I took the time to explore what was next for me and be really intentional about what I needed in the next role.
I know we're going to talk about identity a bit in this
Mhm.
conversation,
Yeah.
but and it has come up a bit on the show, is that we tie ourselves so much to the work as part of our
Yes.
identity.
Right.
So it's interesting that this did happen to you, but so early on, it actually almost is better that it happened then
Yes.
rather than 20, 30 years later,
Mhm.
where it's not so much as the resilience of I'll never get fired, but it is but this is who I am. Who am I if I'm not this?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
for you
Mhm.
to have that sort of reflection at such a young age to better prepare yourself for later on,
Mhm.
amazing.
Mhm.
But a lot of us don't get that opportunity, or at least look at it that way so
Right.
readily.
Yeah. Yeah. And yes, that's true. Now, fast forward 25, 30 years later, I got a new leader, a new executive that I reported to, and it was clear that they and I were not on the same page. So I chose to exit, and also went through a bit of a transformation again. But I took that opportunity, reflecting on that first experience, and how do I use this as a mentor said to me, use it as a sabbatical, as a time for reflection about who am I. And like you have talked about, yes, my identity was starting to get wrapped up again in the work that I did, and that also created an opportunity for, like, no, that's not, yes, it's important to me, this work, but it is not who I am. I am Joel Bettis. I am a man of faith, a man who loves his work and wants to contribute to the world, to better society. And that's what I leaned into during that second time, which was much later in my career.
Hey, if you're enjoying the insights from our guests, you'll love our Raw Notes newsletter. It's packed with guest takeaways, the resources that inspire them, and my own tips on how we as leaders can be better humans for the humans that we're responsible for. Go to relationshipsatworkshow.com and subscribe now and help the workplace be more human. I want to get into conversations around identity consciousness
Yeah.
because I think that's kind of what we're dipping our
Yeah.
toe into right
Right.
now. But before we get further, we have to sort of set the table as to what we're even talking
Yes.
about, Joel. Now, I know the word humility, I
Yeah.
know the word cultural,
Mhm.
but you are talking about a thing called cultural humility. And I'm
Yes.
kind of curious as to how you define that, especially when it comes to leadership in the workplace.
Yeah, so cultural humility is this posture that allows leaders to navigate the complexity that comes with creating a sense of belonging in their organizations and the psychological safety. Meaning that this complexity, or actually, I'm working on another book talking about the instability that exists in the world, and that's just the new normal. I think we're just going to continue to be experience instability, but it's being able to develop the ability to navigate that complexity. And cultural humility allows you to do that because there's three characteristics that contribute or make up cultural humility. The first is self-awareness and self-critique, which I know you've had guests on your show talking about the importance of self-awareness, which I believe is foundational in anything that we do as a leader. Second is redressing the power imbalances or addressing the power imbalances that exist in your organizations, because as you share more about yourself, as you get to know your people, you're going to see there's some things that need to be fixed because certain groups experience your organization different than other groups. And so you want to redress or address those power imbalances. And ultimately, that leads to organizational and systemic change. But it's circular, it's not linear, but it always starts with self-awareness and self-critique. Cultural humility is a posture. So I always describe it as having open arms, because you're going to need to learn how to navigate that complexity, be comfortable with ambiguity, and realize that society will continue to change and demographics have changed and they will continue to change. And so what worked 15, 20 years ago doesn't work anymore. Why? Because society has changed. Our employees have changed. We got a new generation of employees coming into the organization. Our families are changing. The things we talk about are changing. And so this posture really bleeds into every part of our life, not just our work life.
So, in doing research for this conversation, cultural competence came up a lot as well. Are they the same thing? Is there some difference that should be noted between the two?
Yeah, so I talk about in my book, cultural competency is the foundation.
Okay.
It is where you start. But as when I do these talks and I have conversations with leaders, cultural competency for me early on I always felt like there should be more, because it felt like cultural competency was a box to check, an I to dot, or a T to cross. And the reality is things shift and morph. And cultural humility is that posture that it allows you to, navigate or surf those waves that are going to continue to come at you. Whereas competency always felt like to me as an endpoint. And this work does not end. So cultural competency is the foundation, and you need to keep developing those aspects of cultural competency and cultural humility, because things will continue to evolve, and it's not a destination. And I know that frustrates some leaders, because people want, just tell me what to do so I can fix it. Well, the reality is that the world is such that you just can't flip a switch or turn it off. It's always going to be shifting and morphing, and there's going to be challenges that come along the way. And it's about developing this posture to navigate when those challenges occur, to navigate them well, so that you're, one, supporting yourself, but then also supporting the leaders around you and your families and your organizations.
I think, and I love the way you're talking about it, I think it also is a differentiation between leadership and management. Because you're talking about what leaders should do, but what gets in the way is what managers do.
Yeah.
So leaders are about transformation. Managers are about checklists.
Yes.
Right. We have to deliver a thing. Here's the 5 steps I have to do to do the thing. That's not the human. That's not leadership. So I totally on board. The problem is that we'll say leaders are doing this or not doing this. I'm like, but they're not leaders. We're defining them wrong. So what helps a lot for a lot of people to understand certain concepts, I think, is to sort of go, what does that look like? And what does that not look like in the workplace? So if an organization is culturally humble, can you say that? Sure. Culturally humble or not culturally humble, what does that tangibly look like every day in an organization?
Yeah, an organization that's culturally humble is always evaluating itself to get better, particularly when it comes to its workforce. And what I mean by that is I'm a big data person. And so how do we collect data in a way that really highlights the stories of the people that work for us so that we better understand them? And that's the difference in organizations that just are more management focused, where you're just sort of hurting people and creating widgets, which is, important, right? I mean, you got to stay in business. You got to make products. You got to deliver goods. But what gets in the way is when you do it that way is people who have identities that come to work, who are bringing things from outside of work into work. Managers aren't always developed in a way to really understand how do you navigate when someone brings what's happening outside in the political environment, in their families, in their communities into work. And that's happening whether we like it or not. A manager will like, well, just give me a checklist, right? So I can like make sure they're doing this, and that. If they're not doing that, that's a problem and they need to go. Leadership is like, let me sit with Russell and really help so I can understand what's happening. And then I can create some space for them to be reflective and what it is that they need that I can support them with so they can continue to do their work at a high capacity. And that is, I believe, the difference between an organization that's culturally humble and one that is not, or more focused on the just getting the widgets out the door. And I would say the organizations that who practice cultural humility or are working towards that are the ones that are going to end up in the end being much more successful and be more profitable.
We've jumped around a bit about the identity piece here, and I love that you sort of tapped into sort of the DNA of this show, which I believe every if you're a good leader, you have three things: self-awareness, situational awareness, and communication. You are not a leader if you cannot lean into any of those. So you're kind of talking about the first two deeply. But I want to start again with that self-awareness piece, which you talk about specifically in your coaching, which is called identity conscious leadership. What is that? Is it a self awareness exercise? Who am I? How do I show up? What are my triggers? And then the reason I ask this is because I want to make it more of a link to cultural humility in just sort of that sense.
Yeah. So where identity is really important, and I call it a superpower, is so for me, I said earlier when I introduced myself, I'm Mexican American, Chicano, Spanish is my first language. That's a part of my identity, right? My culture is a part of my identity. And early on in my career, I was conditioned to sort of hide it because I wanted to go along to get along, right? I didn't want to be the angry brown guy, right? And so when I was able to really fully lean into it, then that's when I really started to flourish, and seeing my identity as a source of strength, my cultural identity. I'm also identified as a cisgender man, right? It is who I am. I also am a man of faith. Faith is a huge component in my life. It's really for me to lean into those things and see them as sources of strength, right? So even if you're a white dude, there is a source of strength to that, and for you not to be afraid of that, but you got to be comfortable with it, and that's where the getting comfortable with your identity is really important. So when I work with clients, particularly clients who identify as white male, is I talk about, so how do you show up at work? How is your identity playing out? And that's where the self-awareness piece comes in, because a client of mine, we'll just call him Tim. Tim identifies as white male, also LGBTQ, right? That's part of his identity. But we were talking about how his whiteness shows up at work. And I said, okay, so he came to me and said, hey, Joel, I have this employee. He identifies as Black, who's really unhappy. And he's unhappy with the way that the way our organization is addressing issues. It was around not very far after the murder of George Floyd. And I said, okay, so how are you showing up in that space? And he said, well, I acknowledge that I'm a white guy and I have some things to learn. I said, that's good. How are you engaging in the conversation so you can help this employee, so you can understand what this employee is experiencing, right? Even though you may have a hard time identifying with what they're experiencing. So we coached, and ultimately where we landed was that Tim would ask this, we'll call him Brian. He would ask Brian, so tell me more about how you're feeling. And so Brian shared, he's like, okay, what does change look like for you in order for you to feel like the organization is doing what you feel like it should do? And Brian shared, and then Tim came back to me. I said, how was that? He's like, it was really good. I learned a lot. And now what I've learned is I realize that I have some things that I need to address as the leader, right? That's going to lead to organizational change. So Tim leaned into his whiteness, want to call it that, acknowledging that he had this ability to engage in conversations because he has um, unearned privilege that he brings into the workplace. So when I say identity is your superpower, I'm not just talking about identity for cultural identity or gender identity or sexual identity. I'm talking about all your identities and learning how to see them as sources of strength instead of sources that are getting in the way of you being successful. And so in this next book I'm writing, I'm talking about self-awareness, and the key aspect of that is using your identity as a superpower.
Is it always a superpower though? Because I mean, not everything is binary here, ones and
Right.
zeros. So
Mm-hmm.
as much as I understand that your identity is a superpower, but you also need to be back humble about it. You need
Yes.
to be have some humility about
Right.
it. So I can white, cis,
Mm-hmm.
male. There's a lot in those three things that are, very combative or very contrary
Mm-hmm.
to progressiveness, to
Yep.
transformation. So it just sounds weird for me to go, well, I need to lean into the power of my whiteness.
Yeah.
That sounds rough.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's fair.
So I'm just
Yeah.
trying to understand, how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, well, one, it's acknowledging, right, that if we're going to continue with the example of someone who identifies as white, cisgender, is recognizing what may get in the way because of your identity, right? That may be impeding you from understanding others' experiences, right? I identify as cisgender male. I know that as a man, I have some unearned privileges that I need to acknowledge, but there's also some things that I can bring in that are sources of strength. So it's learning how to balance, one, recognize what are the strengths and what are the growth areas for me that are going to continue to be growth areas, right? And so that's where I think it's important for leaders to get clear about who they are. And no, I mean, if I you earlier when you introduced me, you said I'm a Gallup Strength certified coach, right? So I know strengths are really important, but strengths can get in the way, right? If we push them to an extreme. So I'm not saying you don't acknowledge the things that may be impeding you because of your identities. I think that's part of the self-awareness piece. But where it's really important that a lot of leaders don't get is, what do you do when those when those blind spots show up, right? How do I recognize that blind spots are showing up so that I can adjust and be better and not let them get in the way of of me being successful? And that's where the self-awareness piece is really important. So your identity could eventually become challenging for you or get in the way, but if you're good about knowing who you are, you will know when that stuff starts showing up and then pivot or acknowledge it and realize that no, I can do something different here. But it takes, one, knowing who you are, and then how it can get in the way of you being the leader that I call it exceptional leadership. Yeah.
We don't get super aware overnight, though. I mean,
No,
self-awareness is not something many people have, leaders or otherwise.
Yeah.
So what kind of internal work would you recommend for people to sort of lean into so they're even able to embrace cultural humility?
Yeah. So one of the instruments that I like to use is the Intercultural Development Inventory. It's called the IDI for short. One, it measures how you bridge across cultural differences. And so that's an awareness tool so that you can begin to recognize where you're at on this intercultural development continuum, and then determine, okay, I want to move along the continuum towards a particular aspect of the continuum. And that's the first self-awareness piece. I also talk about getting really clear or understanding where your biases are or what your biases are, right? Because we all have bias. Our brain, we're trained to have bias, and that's kind of going with Malcolm Gladwell's work around we create shortcuts, which then ends up getting in the way biases start showing up. So getting clear on your bias. So I talk about getting clear about your biases, developing cultural self-awareness, and then other awareness, meaning getting to know the people around you so you can hear their stories and share your story. But the self-awareness piece is a heavy lift. And so what I in addition to instruments, it's about, okay, one of the things I work with clients on is, and I do this as a coach now, is when I'm going into a coaching session, is I ask myself, what bias do I need to check, right? And asking yourself as a leader, what biases do I need to check as I walk into this meeting, right? But it's getting clear what biases you may have and how do they show up. So it's a lot of, could be assessments, could be self-reflection, but also could be asking people in your life who you trust to say, hey, I've been told this in the past that I show up this way. Is that true? Am I getting good feedback? But it requires you to have some level of comfort of being vulnerable. And that is hard. And I'm not saying that's an easy thing. But if we're going to move towards being exceptional leaders, we need to start that process. But you're right, it's not overnight. It takes time, and vulnerability. And that could be, a span of 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year. And it's always happening, right? Because when we get performance evaluations, that could be a self-awareness piece, right? We've just been made aware of something, right? And so one of the things I talk about, 3 aspects of developing a posture of cultural humility are growth mindset, deep curiosity, and deep listening, right? And so if you have a growth mindset, if you develop a growth mindset, you're going to be able to see when you get constructive feedback as an opportunity to grow and use it that way, instead of like, nope, I'm not changing. That just, Russell's got to deal with it, right? Which sometimes some leaders do, right? Like, I don't want to change. This is who I am. You just got to learn how to manage up. Well, I mean, yes, you can do it that way and you may have some success, but ultimately people are going to feel burnt out and they're not going to want to work for you.
Want more from our conversations on the show? Subscribe to the Raw Notes newsletter. It's where I share top takeaways from our guests, the resources that fuel their success, and my personal insights on how we as leaders can be more human. And we need more human. Go to relationshipsatworkshow.com and sign up today to keep your leadership journey on the right path. How do you know you're getting it right? Because we go back to that whole manager versus leader thing where is it performative or performance?
Yeah.
So how do we know we are not checkboxing and we're actually making a difference either for ourselves or those around us?
I would say it all comes back to asking people for feedback, right? Which again is not easy. That's why I did a self-awareness course on LinkedIn Learning, and I talk about identifying people around you who can give you honest feedback that you trust, so you can check yourself, kind of like what I talked about earlier. But it's asking for feedback, creating the feedback loops that you're going to need in order to confirm. And maybe you need a mentor in your life who's just going to kick your ass every so often to say, no, you're not being honest with yourself, right? And so that is important as well. So identifying people around you who can give you that feedback, and then taking that feedback, go, okay, I hear that, and here's how I'm going to adjust. And then let's see how it goes, right? Leadership is a work in progress. It's not like you become a great leader overnight, right? It takes time, but you got to be willing to put the work into it.
We've mentioned diversity and we've mentioned generations, and that's sort of where I'm kind of curious about. We have a lot of generations, mine included, Gen Xers, who are rewarded by having power, are rewarded by checking boxes, not leading, but actually, putting out fires and moving up. So you talk about in your research and in your book about giving up power to share power with others. But there's a lot of people that do not want to do that because they've been in command and control their whole hierarchical career. What is a light switch? What is something, based on your coaching background, is there something that sort of like moves the needle with that sort of thinking? That, I mean, you talk about curiosity a bit, but even that seems to be hard to crack that nut sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's a good question. I would say, as I think about it, reflect on the people I've worked with, I think power is, we're rewarded for working with power, for demonstrating power, because we feel like it gets things done, right? I would say what has transpired for me in my own life is seeing what's happening in the world around me and realize that even though I think I have power, I really don't. I mean, and to me, that's a humbling experience, right? Letting go of those certainties, right? As I've moved up the corporate ladder. And so generally what I have found is it's experiences or someone just says, Joel, you got it wrong. Like you messed up and something's got to change, right? That watershed moment. Now, not everyone may say, no one's giving me that feedback. Right. And so I think just sitting back and creating space for reflection is going to open up the doors for you to see things that you may not be seeing. But generally, it's something that happens in the workplace, outside the workplace, in your family that makes you realize, like, crap, I think I have power, but I really don't have power. And I have things I need to work on, right? And that's where the personal comes into the workplace, right? Because we see things that are happening in the world that we cannot control. We also may experience something in our families. I have a 19-year-old who struggles with depression, right? He was not safe for a while. That was humbling because I thought I was raising a good, strong person, right? And that wasn't happening. And so it shed some light on me on how I was showing up as a father. And it made some things click for me of like the importance of mental health and how we take care of ourselves and talk about ourselves. And so all that to say, Russell, is when those moments happen, creating space for reflection and then asking ourselves, being curious, why am I feeling this way? What's happening? What does it say about me as a leader? And how do I integrate what I'm learning into how I lead?
And don't treat it like it's a workshop. Like, because for the way you're talking, I'm like, okay, but how do we get consistent?
Mm-hmm.
But that's where I'm guessing we operationalize this from a feedback loop going,
Yep.
okay, when's the last time I checked in? I need to do it every 3 months. I need to do it every week, depending on where I am
Mm-hmm.
with my own awareness and where I need to fix.
Mm-hmm.
Professionally or personally, there needs to be that milestones, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
We get back to being a little checklisty here. But I think that's where it helps with the consistency to allow us to do these things.
Yeah. And then being flexible and knowing that what's working now for me may not work 10 years from now, right? Because things have changed. I've changed. And being okay with that ambiguity, which isn't always an easy thing either.
Because again, we're back to identity going, but this is who I am, but you're not that person anymore. You don't do that work anymore. You don't lead that way anymore.
Right.
So yeah, it's I can totally see this as more of a journey than just unfortunately we're like, we only have the budget to do this once, Joel. Sorry, we're gonna have to see again in 2 years when we have next fiscal conversation. I'm like, oh, then you're not doing the work.
Yeah. Well, it's giving people building their capacity to build space into and giving them the ability to build that space into their work. Right. And some companies want to do that and others don't. Right. They're like, well, that just costs too much money, or it doesn't help us meet our financial goals. Well, I think if you're successful at it, my guess is you may see the return on investment, not immediately, but 3 to 5 years down the road when your team feels like, oh, I really love working here because I feel valued, I feel accepted, and I'm given the ability to be the best that I can be and develop myself as a leader that this organization wants me to be.
So let's expand it beyond the leader, because you can't be much of a leader if you're not leading other people.
Right.
So it's you can't lead in a silo. Mm-hmm. So introducing cultural humility to a team, regardless of size, that you're responsible for. How do you introduce this in? You've done the reflection, you've done the work, you've gotten really curious, but you then have to go to work, or you then have to interact with others who may not see it the same way you do or have not done the work. But you still have to interact on a daily basis because you're responsible for those people. How do you do that when people have such different lived experiences?
Well, one is modeling it for people, right? To share more about myself, share more about my experiences, so that the people that work for you can feel comfortable sharing more about themselves, because if their leaders model it, they're going to be more they're going to feel freer to do that themselves. And I'm not saying cultural humility doesn't mean there's no accountability, right? I think that's important to recognize too. It doesn't mean like everything is touchy feely is great and important, but it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be accountability, right? That's where you lean into your principles, your values, the organization's values, and you're going to create space for reflection. But you still got to get the work done, right? But I think for me, what I have found of value to me is when people want to get to know who I am, what makes me tick, and then think about, okay, how do we leverage Joel's strengths in order to meet our organizational goals or our department's goals or our team goals, and having a conversation of what that looks like. But that means me, the leader, sitting down with the people that I lead to really get to know them and create space for them to share more about themselves. That's going to be key. And then say, okay, we've agreed. You and I, Russell, have agreed that we're going to work towards this. That is the agreement. And then if the agreement is broken, then there needs to be a conversation. Like, well, we agreed to this. Remember, Russell, we agreed that this would happen. It didn't happen. There needs to be some consequences, right? And so then you talk about how you do that, and that's important. And I say this in the book, it doesn't mean there isn't accountability. I mean, when people really mess up, right, people need to be held accountable. But if you're creating a culture where people don't feel like they can mess up or make mistakes, that's going to create some friction, and people don't feel like, well, if I'm punished for making a mistake, I'm not going to take risks, and then the organization is going to ultimately suffer, or the team's going to suffer, the department's going to suffer, because we said we want creativity, right? But that means creating space for creativity to happen. And so I don't know if I got to your question, but I think that's that's my initial response, is modeling it, creating space to listen to people, and to recognize that not everyone's going to feel comfortable sharing about themselves. And that's okay. But you've created the space for them to do it if they choose to. And you have to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is important, but you have to have purpose with your vulnerability. It's not just about you sharing all your dark secrets, because that's not appropriate, right? So I when I work with leaders, I talk about, okay, if you're going to be vulnerable, you have to let people know why you're being vulnerable. Like, what is it you want them to take away from your vulnerability? And vulnerability is important, but it has to have a purpose. It can't just be vulnerable for the sake of being vulnerable, because that's going to make people like, well, why is Joel crying right now? Like, I don't understand. And so anyway.
Let me give you an example I kind of want to dig into a little bit. So this all sounds great. Unfortunately, nothing is that easy. We've kind of mentioned this, right? So as leaders, we mess up all the time. But if we're introducing this into a team, we're talking from basically what I'm hearing is empowerment, I'm hearing inclusion, I'm hearing belonging, if we do it right. Mm-hmm. But we as leaders, we mess up. And if we're empowering our teams to call out exclusion, what if we're the ones that did it? Because we do this, we stumble, we have our own biases that tend to come up. Mm-hmm. So in that situation, we've created a safe space, but then suddenly we're the quote unquote target of that vitriol or frustration. Or how do we handle that? Because I mean, that can be very hard, because as an identity based person, you're like, but I'm a good leader, look, I'm trying real hard, and yet I might be a part of the problem, or at least in this scenario. How do you handle that?
Yeah, so in the book I talk about how to recover from when I do these trainings, about particularly when we commit a microaggression. Mm-hmm. And even as a man of color, I make mistakes, and I need to own those mistakes, right? I still stick my foot in my mouth, right? Or I still may treat someone differently and not realize what I'm doing. When I'm called out for it, what I advise or leaders to do is apologize, right? I'm sorry that happened, but not expect a response, right? Or not ask the person, help me get better. Well, that person may not want to help you get better. But apologizing, owning it, and recognizing that you probably may need to walk away for a while and say, hey, Russell, I know that I offended you. I'm really sorry. You don't need to respond. I may come back to you in a couple weeks and ask for some feedback, which again, you have the ability to say no to. Just walk away. So an example I'll share is I was doing a keynote for an organization on culture humility. I used an example that just didn't land well with a particular person in the audience. They sent me an email where they gave me some feedback, and it was really like, I can't believe you did that. That I felt really, I felt like you weren't practicing what you're preaching. And I said, okay. So I read the feedback. I sent an email. I said, first of all, I am so sorry you felt that way. I would be happy to have a conversation with you so that I can fully understand, but you don't need to respond to this email if you don't want to. They never responded, right? I think sometimes because the danger, there's a book that I think Wadsworth is one of the authors. It's called "Did That Just Happen?" They talk about how organizations should. They give a blueprint for organizations and people to use when they make mistakes like this. Is a lot of times we get defensive and we make it more about me than about the other person. And I think getting comfortable with, at times, you may say things, you may do things, the organization may do things, and the first thing should be to apologize and not expect a response or demand a response. Instead of what sometimes happens, oh, Russell, I'm so sorry. That's not what I meant. That's not how I wanted it to come across. And then it becomes more about me and how I feel, right? Intent versus impact. Yeah, you had good intentions, but the impact didn't go very well. So not recognizing that, even though your intention was good, the impact was X, and recognizing that and apologizing and not expecting a response unless that person wants to give you a response, and giving them permission to say no, or to like, yeah, let's have lunch. Let's talk about this. And back to your point, Russell, is you have to lay that out ahead of time of how you're going to, if this happens, here's how I'm going to respond. And here's how I'm giving you, not permission, but I'm giving you have the ability to say no to me. So everyone knows what the rules of engagement are, right? Creating the common language. And that's what a lot of organizations don't do, whether it's conflict or confrontation or microaggressions or whatever, is they don't do a good job of creating the common language for the organization of how they're going to interact when mistakes are made or when conflict or confrontation occurs.
What are we risking by avoiding discomfort? Mm-hmm. Because we've talked about what we can do, mm-hmm. but we haven't mentioned really, well, what if we don't? What if we go, well, you know what? I'm sorry you didn't like my presentation. That's a you problem, not a me problem. Ooh, not. As someone who's done some divisive speaking in my own way, people loved it, and there were some people that were certainly triggered by it. Fair, maybe I'm doing a good job that way. But I could have avoided, or you could have avoided in that situation and just said, that's on you. What are we doing? How are we hurting our teams or the organization by avoiding that?
Well, one, it's not taking the opportunity to figure out having that growth mindset. What can I learn from this, right? How is it going to help me be a better leader? How is it going to help me understand that other person better, right? I think we miss the opportunity for growth if we just choose to ignore it or sweep it under the rug. And that's you, it's not me. Too bad for you. There might be some truth. I mean, I'm not saying that everyone's interpretation of what I said or what I did is always correct. But taking that moment to not just brush it under the rug, because that's the danger, right? We like, oh, too bad for them, right? But what if we said, oh, okay, that's interesting. So when I'm working with a client of someone who identified from an underestimated group or underrepresented group, when they come to me and say, hey, Joel, this happened at work, I said, oh, okay. How are you feeling? I'm really sorry that happened to you. did you talk to anyone who was also in the room just to get confirmation that what you heard is what you heard, right? Are there people that you can go to? As Russell said this, or Joel said this, did I hear that right? And it could be that, Leon thinks, oh yeah, they definitely meant that's what they said. And then the question for someone who's maybe not in a position of power is, do you feel like you have the ability to confront Russell or confront Joel about what just happened? And if it's no, then I never advise clients, hey, if you're not feeling like you have the ability to bring something up to your boss because there's a fear of losing your job or retaliation, then don't do it. Right. But to back to your original question is you have to create that space for reflection, even when you get feedback that may just go like, yeah, that's not what I intended, or that's on them, it's not on me. To just say, hey, is there an opportunity for me to learn something about myself here? Mm-hmm. Requires discipline, requires practice, because a lot of times we're just conditioned, like especially as leaders as we move up, is we're like, wow, I've been told to just develop thick skin. So too bad for you that you felt that way, right? And then we may be missing some really good feedback that we need to hear. And so building in a reflection of when you receive that feedback to say, okay, what is it that I heard here? And how can I learn from it? Or are there things that I can learn from it?
Yeah, I think that's where we can confuse resilience a little bit with that thick skin thing of right. Going, well, look, I can handle these difficult. No, you're avoiding them. Your thick skinnedness is not connection. Mm-hmm. It mm-hmm. is one-offedness or, mm-hmm. or pushback, as it were.
Exactly.
In a larger organization, mm-hmm. There's this reoccurring elephant in the room where we talk about DEI programs, especially American side of things these days. So I was trying to think of systems and policies that kind of get in the way of cultural humility. And this is one that keeps coming up, is these programs that are others, or that's somebody else's responsibility. So what are some things that are getting in the way of us being able to do the work you're talking about from an organizational level?
Well, I think, I guess in its simplest form is not understanding the people that are in our organization, right? Not creating space for them. So if you do an employee engagement survey, right, which a lot of large organizations do, whether it's the Gallup survey or some other one, how are you analyzing the data, right? Are you, I have an academic training, right? I have a doctorate. I did research. We were trained, or I'm trained, to disaggregate the data. That's a fancy word for saying, let's break up the data, right? So let's look at how each of the groups experience our organization. And if there are gaps, we probably need to figure out how do we address those gaps to minimize the gaps. So if women are leaving at a higher rate than men, why is that? Is there some narrative that's happening? So what gets in the way is we don't look at data, and data is really important, particularly if you want to make sure that we're meeting our organizational goals when it comes to our employees. It goes back to that Harvard Business Review article around belonging. I think it was 2016 or 2019, where they clearly demonstrate when people don't feel like they belong, they are more apt to leave, which then costs the company much more money than if they just would spend time developing that sense of belonging in their organizations. Because we know, research shows that it's cheaper to keep people than to hire new people at all levels. So I think the mistake that organizations make is they want to treat everyone the same. The reality is not everyone's experiencing the organization the same. And that's your goal, that everyone is doing really well, regardless of demographic group. But the reality is, especially if you've never done a baseline or get a baseline, you don't know what you don't know. And ultimately, it's going to hurt your organization. And that's where the listening to people's stories, that other awareness that gets into the redressing the power imbalances that may exist. But if you don't know they exist, then you can't address them or redress them. And you can't ignore the things. It's gonna be like the frog in the boiling water, right? At some point, the frog dies, because you've never addressed the underlying issue, because you've never gotten the information in order to do that.
So, what does that look like in these touchstones that every organization leans into and cookie cutters like crazy?
Mhm.
Onboarding, leadership training, performance reviews.
Mhm.
How can we bake it? Cultural humility, can we bake it into these things
Yeah.
that have become, well, we don't want to do more work, we've got our onboarding system already in place,
Mhm.
Joel? Why would we, where would we even be able to fit that in?
Yeah, well, and I think it takes the organization to recognize that we have work to do, right? And I talk about onboarding is so important, because if you want people to know what the what the mode of operation is going to be, you have to train people as they come in. So if you value certain things, you start at the beginning, and that if you want to create a culture of belonging, you have to start with the onboarding. And I think that, yes, there's some heavy lifting. I mean, I will acknowledge that it takes an investment. But what's the cost? Well, the cost, if you don't, is X, right? We know that people ultimately will leave the organization if they don't feel like they belong or feel like they are valued, right? And so looking for taking a systemic approach, right? So in the book, I talk about, I present a particular framework um, around these dimensions of, vitality and viability. So what are you doing to instill this work in the organization for the long term? Because you can't just hire a person or create a program to solve your problem. So what kind of investment are you making to sustain your initiatives over time? What are you doing in training and development? What are you doing to identify where there might be some conflict that exists between groups, or recognizing the data about, like, okay, how are each of these groups experiencing the organization? And then where are you identifying talent in? Like, where are you hiring people from, and who are you hiring? Those are four aspects that an organization really needs to dig into. Identify metrics, because it's not just about doing a program, having Joel show up and do a workshop, and that's going to solve your problems. It's about, okay, where do we instill these things along the way so that it begins to embed it or becomes part of the DNA of the culture? And that takes time, but it starts with having a framework to use, as opposed to just taking a piecemeal approach or throwing spaghetti up the wall and see what sticks.
I can see communication being a big piece of this. I'm going to go back to my three pillars of
uh,
great leadership.
uh,
Is how do we need to change how we communicate, especially from an executive level, or from an organizational level? I mean, I know some organizations will be like, but look, we have a cultural month. We're mentioning a few things that are special in that month,
mm-hmm,
Black History Month, that sort of thing.
mm-hmm,
But again, we go back to that. It feels performative. It
mm-hmm,
feels like, well, you're just saying that because your HR department told you should,
mm-hmm,
as opposed to it being, back to saying, baked in.
mm-hmm.
So, how would you like organizations, a culturally humble organization, what do they need to be paying attention to communicate? Because that's what people connect to.
Yeah, that's a good question. And the way I talk with organizations, when I work with organizations, is you have to communicate the progress you're making and the progress you're not making, right? Like being transparent, like, hey, our goal was X, right? Or we wanted our our employee engagement survey to do this, but what we found was this, right? There's work that we have to do. We're going to set some metrics and goals based on that, and then every year, every 2 years, we're going to report back to you so you can see what's happening. The problem with the challenge that organizations had when they, after the murder of George Floyd, is they made all these statements, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of organizations did, but the organizations that were successful were the ones that said, okay, we're going to make this statement, and that's important, but we're also going to look at ourselves deeply to see where does the work need to happen, and then we got to do the work, but we have to let people know that we're doing the work, so that way it moves from performative to sustaining those efforts over time. It's not just about saying we're going to invest $30 million in this. Okay, in a year, let's report out, how was the $30 million used? What changes are we actually seeing? Creating data is very important to this work, becoming a culturally humble organization. You have to look at the data, but you have to report the data out to your employees, to your stakeholders. That's where organizations get themselves into trouble when they don't report out, even if it's not going well, because then people don't feel like there's any accountability. You just made a statement, awesome, but what's it doing? What are you doing in a year from now? And organizations weren't willing to report that out, and because they were afraid, right, of the negative backlash. But that communicated something to people, like you're just being performative. Yeah.
I think a big piece of this is that organizations need to be less reactive. And because, to your point, George Floyd, oh yeah, tons. The pendulum went really far one way, and then the political world changed, and the pendulum swang way too far the other way. So there almost feels like there's this. I'm not saying this in a political way. A middle ground. I avoided the word central. A middle ground where it's operational, where it's just part of what you do based on the data that it is providing.
Yep.
And the communication attached to it. And yet organizations want to be reactive because that's how that's because it's pressure as opposed to change.
Yep. Oh, I would agree with you. I think it requires leadership at the top who's willing to say, yes, we have to make a statement, we have to apologize, and then we have to back that up with action. And those are the organizations that are going to demonstrate progress and attract people to want to work for that organization, invest in that organization, and because they're willing to recognize, hey, we have work to do, whether it's around ethnicity, culture, gender, sexual identity. People are going to want to work for organizations like that and ultimately lead to their success. The organizations that don't do that well are going to maybe, they may still be profitable, but not to the fullest capacity. Right, and not retaining their talent, and that's going to cost an organization money.
To wrap up our chat, last question I kind of like to leave it on is just maybe something that we can do. So there's anybody listening that's like, I want to be culturally humble. I want to sort of move the needle on that humbleness. I keep dancing around humble and try to using it in a different way. What can we do, say tomorrow, to just be more informed, your action? What would you recommend is that first little step in the right direction?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that if you want this, the first step is to ask yourself, what am I not listening to in myself around this particular topic? Or what am I afraid to talk? What am I afraid to acknowledge in myself around this topic? And write it down and reflect. Right? Be curious about what you just wrote. And that's going to start the process. And then the follow-up is, who do I need to bring into this conversation to help me get better at the things that I know I need to get better at?
That is Dr. Joel Pérez. He is an executive and leadership coach, speaker, and consultant. And he's written a book you should check out called Dear White Leader, How to Achieve Organizational Excellence Through Cultural Humility. And amazingly, I didn't ask anything about the title. Not once. And I'm not going to ask him. I'm sure he gets asked that all the time.
I do.
I'm not going to ask him.
Yeah. And you can, if you go to the website, the dearwhiteleader.com website, there's some podcasts that I did about the title. And so you could find out more about the title.
Sure. Plug another podcast on my podcast. Thanks, Dr. Joel. Totally. Thank you so much for being here, Joel. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that will do it. Another episode of Relationships at Work, a leadership podcast helping you build workplace connection, improve culture, and avoid blind spots. I'm Russell. Thank you for being here once again. If you like the show, share. Let others know. We've been around for 330 plus episodes and still growing, still advancing, still moving forward. And we do that all with your help. So if you found this show valuable or any episodes in our huge library valuable, please pass them along to others, just one other person even. And anything that helps any of us become better leaders, I think is an important action. And we can't do this alone. So if you share, I'm sure they'll really, really appreciate it. Okay, take care of yourself, and I'll talk to you again soon.